Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be amongst you. I would like to thank Dr. Ghassan Al-Kahlouta and his center for providing this opportunity. Glory be to the martyrs of the Sudanese revolution. We wish speedy recovery for the injured and the quick return for the arbitrary displaced persons. Rasha will be speaking to us, and she is the chief editor of an electronic magazine. She is a researcher and a writer. She has a book entitled Democracy Without Democrats, Parties and the Revolution of October. Rasha Awad has participated in a number of conferences and workshops, and she has numerous published articles as far as the 25th of October's coup and the failure thereby of establishing stability in Sudan. What are the standards that we might resort to measure such failure? And if the coup is talking about the divisions amongst the civilian forces, have these forces tried to bridge the gap between themselves? Thank you. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, thank you. I would like to thank first and foremost the center that has hosted us. We'd like to thank also the state of Qatar, the splendid reception. I would like to thank the center for allowing women to participate in this symposium. This is unprecedented indeed. First and foremost, Sudan today is living within a political dilemma, a plight that is existential, and in order to exit such stalemate, we must diagnose the reality accurately. Sarah has asked about the coup, and the coup took place because of the divisions amongst the civilians. I don't agree with this premise at all, because the coup has its own dynamics. The 25th of October coup has not been the first. Within the transitional period, there was a coup following the massacre of the sit-in on the 3rd of July 2019. The military component took the helm of power following that gruesome massacre. And on this occasion, I would like to send our gratitude to the activists, and we offer our condolences to families of those who have become martyrs. Bashir was about to be toppled, and the coup aimed to follow the suit of al-Bashir's regime, albeit with some amendments or tweaks. Al-Bashir had regional affiliations, and these affiliations have paved the way for another military rule, and there are different also reasons that relate to the fear of the militants of administering justice, and especially the transitional justice, because the transitional justice will entail holding them accountable. There are also economic interests of the security and military sectors, and if there is a political transformation and a system that is based on accountability, transparency, and so on and so forth, this will lead to losing the interests. So these are the main reasons of the coup, rather than the division between the civilian components. We had a constitutional declaration. We had a rule that has been somewhat negative. However, rectifying the previous regime's mistakes ought to have taken place in a democratic fashion, and the problems surfaced, and that was a commonplace following despotism, following authoritarianism over 3 decades. The system was fragile, and problems were deep-rooted. And the new forces lacked rehabilitation, and the former regime worked on driving a wedge between these forces in the past, and they have been disintegrated. However, and nevertheless, we have witnessed a political process that was lively, and this might have led to a good transition. However, the military component has thrown spanner in the work, and but the military has failed because, in accordance with the Sudanese context, there is no objective reason for its success. Regardless of the democratic choice, philosophically speaking, or intellectually, however, by necessity, in Sudan, there is no room for the success of the military coup. The coup must have relied on a unified institution that imposes its will on the Sudanese, but this wasn't there. This was not available in Sudan, and indeed this is a structural kind of problem pertinent to the legacy of the former regime. The state of the Sudan has no ability to monopolize violence by hinging on the military. The military is divided. We have the army and we have the rapid support, which has been based on the background of the conflict in Darfur, but the ousted president relied on such militia to repress any popular revolution against him. Thus, this militia has transformed into a parallel kind of army. They have huge resources, colossal economic resources, and hence it is not feasible for the military or the army to take the helm of power on its own unless it is victorious over the rapid support forces. So the coup might be successful providing there is one army. However, if there are two armies, then one will be at loggerheads with the other. And this is a matter of time, and we might indeed be descending into a civil war. This reality nowadays in the Sudan is a perverse kind of situation, and we are inching closer to fighting amongst each other unless we have a political, meaningful process that is based on the exit of the military, the army from the political process, genuinely speaking, rather than just sending certain messages to the international community and exiting any kind of sham manner. So the army has said in the past that it has withdrawn from the scene and the civilians ought to have formed a government. However, we did not believe such withdrawal because the statements that had followed the maneuver and what the army has sent was emblematic to the fact that the withdrawal will be kind of cosmetic rather than genuine. Why do I say that? Because I say that because the proposals that are pertinent to the role of the army relate to the Higher Council of the Armed Forces that has the mandate of hegemonizing the central bank and controlling the foreign policy, also controlling the military, the police, and the security. That means to control the power in the land. What we want in Sudan is to have a civilian transition. That means to have the power in the hands of the civilians. How could we have a civilian prime minister when they don't control 80% of the economic resources in Sudan? These economic resources are under the control of the security and the army. How can a civilian government governs when it has no control over the central bank, the security, the foreign policy, and the army? This is the sticking point. Now the militants want to withdraw from the political process, from the door, and come back from the window. There is also another proposal by the civilians to have a national council for defense headed by a defense minister who is civilian, and I think this is feasible because this allows the army to carry out their technical kind of responsibilities, but one pillar of democracy relates to the fact that the military must be under the control of the civilian authority. This is the essence of democracy, the essence of the civilian ruling. The democratic rule brought this very idea to the world. The military must be hegemonized or must be under the control of the civilian authority. Another issue is to do with handing over the power to an elected government. That means we need to have an early election. And those who are insiders in Sudan do understand that holding elections in Sudan currently cannot lead to legitimizing the government, politically speaking, because it ought to be preceded by a package of preparations and paving the way for a democratic, genuine competition. In principle, the civilian democratic forces look at the transitional power as a prelude to holding fair and free elections. This is the golden kind of objective of this transitional period, providing that this period is preceded by certain preparations to have one professional army. We can't have elections when there are political parties who are affiliated with certain militias. In addition to that, we must enact structural reforms to the judiciary, the public prosecution. We must have a constitutional court. We must believe in the judiciary in order for the elections to be smooth. There are also other kind of technical issues. We didn't have census, professionally speaking, in Sudan. Up to this moment, we did not create an electoral commission that is consensual. What's important is the fact that the game of the early elections is one of the issues that demonstrate that the army wants to manipulate democracy itself, and they want rigged, premeditated elections so that their proxies can win and democracy will be relegated to the dustbin of history. This is as far as the military is concerned. As regards the civilian component, there are numerous issues that ought to be tackled in order to let the genie out of the bottle, if I might say. The first objective is for the civilian and democratic forces to be unified. They must have one voice through a political channel. They must have one vision, one program for the transition, governed by a constitution that is consensually agreed upon, and we must tap into the youth, the revolutionaries, the rebels, the resistance committees, and so on and so forth. This civilian effort might lead to a unified discourse to liaise with the international community. This might indeed refine the internal discourse as well in Sudan, and there are efforts that are being deployed towards that end. From my own perspective, this pace must be expedited as the political vacuum that we are living through portends that the coup and despotic related choices will have the upper hand, and any venture that is not pre-calculated accurately might lead to a showdown, a military showdown between the two armies that I've talked about. We might have a civil war, and it is very difficult to predict what is around the corner. The coup has disastrously kind of failed. It is being isolated, popularly speaking, and internationally as well. The openness that has started in Sudan during the transition period to go back to the international community and the economic support and so on and so forth. These projects have been halted due to this military coup. We have an economic problem. It doesn't resonate with the Sudanese, in addition to the differences between the leaders or the putschists. They talk about the differences amongst the civilians. This is normal to have differences. It is normal. However, it is dangerous when we have differences and divisions between the armed men, because they will resort to arms to settle such scores, to settle such differences. Differences between the civilians, the peaceful people, will be kind of solved peacefully. However, between the army or amongst the army officers, things will be different. As far as the international community and the region, what are the overlapping interests in this regard? And do you think that there is one formula that we might hinge upon to allocate such or pinpoint such overlaps or intersections? In the region, there is no benign kind of actors. Interest is what has been pursued by the international community and the region. The Sudanese political forces must have a smart discourse that understands the interest of our nation, and we must talk to the international community and the region. As far as the international community is concerned, objectively speaking, the US, the EU, these countries have not supported the military coup, and the pressures exerted by these countries have led to categorizing the putschists because there are pressures, especially economic pressures, on the military, and the US and the EU are asking for a civilian government. On the 11th of December 2020, there was a legislation that has been enacted in the Congress, and it is to do with the transitional period in Sudan. The act of the transitional period in Sudan aims at boosting the civilian control over the security and the army. And indeed, this took place before the coup, and it raised the issue of the security contractors and the structural reforms in Sudan, the central bank's reforms, the Ministry of Finance reforms, and so on and so forth. And there are threats of imposing sanctions on the militants, the military officers, if they do not take heed of such act in the Congress. I think that the international community stance vis-a-vis the issue of Sudan is positive, and we can tap into it. However, I say that with caution, because tapping into this opportunity, i.e. the opposition of the coup by the international community, if we don't invest quickly in this, this opportunity might dissipate, might evaporate. As for the region, I don't divulge a secret if I say that the neighboring countries of Sudan do not want democracy in our country. They differ in the nuances, and they support one faction here and one faction there, and they have their own vision as for the military control in Sudan. We must be transparent and we must be frank. We must be genuine in addressing this issue. We in Sudan, we don't have, we can't afford to have a traditional dictatorship, as I said before. So any coup choice by the control of the army or by the control of the rapid support forces will lead to a civil war, will lead to clashes between the rapid forces and the army. Some people bet on the civil war. They say we might be victorious. However, and in accordance with the past experience, the civil war will save no one, and the democratic, peaceful, stable Sudan is the panacea, especially for the region and for the stability of the region, and thus we must talk to the regional powers and say that it is impossible to have a military dictatorship in Sudan that might lead to stability. Military dictatorship means descending into a civil war. As for the democratic and civilian forces in Sudan, they must have a project of democratic transition within a framework that is friendly to the international community and the region, because we do have numerous problems, and we need decades to solve them. So we don't want to add insult to injury, and we don't want Sudan to be unstable, and we don't want Sudan to interfere in other countries' internal affairs, and we don't want the other countries to interfere in our affairs, so that we can stave off any civil war. Dictatorship in Sudan has been a failure. The civil war has been a failure, and we cannot think always of the Arab Spring. Sudan is different. Sudan has went through democracy and parliamentary democracy since 1964, and then in 1985, before the Arab Spring, so democracy has been experienced in Sudan, and it is a demand by necessity. No one can enforce his own volition over the other, so we need to have a political formula that is based on a win-win approach to have stability in the Sudan towards democracy and towards structural reforms in Sudan that ought to be deep, because we have deep problems in Sudan. In conclusion, this difficult situation necessitates a complicated kind of, or an advanced kind of solution, or a sophisticated solution. We need not to resort to destitution. We must be patient. We must go through the democratic transition to pave the way to have a transitional period that is successful. The transitional period is the period that paves the way towards change with democratic means. We cannot solve the economic and developmental problems that are chronic in Sudan, and the transitional period ought not to exceed 3 or 4 years, but what we make in this period will have its own implications, and we need to have reforms, the reforms that relate to the fairness of the election, especially when it comes to the security and the army. We must have to arrive at this objective, and it is continuous, especially when it comes to the reforms that are partial in this period, and we hope that it will be successful. The reform of Sudan needs some time, and people are talking about Islamists in Sudan. What we do say to them from this rostrum, we say the Islamists cannot impose the tutelage on the state of Sudan again. And as we talk about democracy, democracy must guarantee the rights to all through partnership rather than guardianship, and the Islamists do control the deep state, and they must stop sabotaging Sudan, and they must not drag the country to a civil war, believing that the civil war will lead to their control. The civil war will disintegrate Sudan, and thus these issues are very important, and Sudan must be livable, and we must deploy efforts to arrive at our success. Otherwise, we will be, as the poet Abbas has said, the country is dissolving as if it is an ice amidst the scorching heat, and we are crying, and we are being taken as sheeps being slaughtered. We ask about this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Rasha. We'll come back to in the Q&A session. Our next speaker is Mr. Ahmed Alhaj. He is a representative of the civil society, and Mr. Ahmed Alhaj is a writer in the Al-Hadatha journal, and he holds a BA in Business Studies from Khartoum University. Mr. Ahmed, so far as consensus reaching between the civil or civilian parties or forces is so far not there, and why have they failed in this? Thank you very much, Ms. Sarah Eissa, and thank you to the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies for opening this strategic horizon for us to do some homework that many Sudanese have been trying to evade lately, in not having a democratic dialogue, a real democratic dialogue between political forces, especially what one can call the left in the Sudan, if we can call it that, and the center powers also, the modern forces, and also the conventional powers. I think this opportunity will allow many who are engaged in political work and engaged in working to effect a change, and the basic activists to place them in clear categories so that we can each understand the other's position vis-a-vis the future of ruling Sudan. And also it's an appointment to take the activists in the diaspora, and I met a number of young men and women who had the opportunity to get to know different visions regarding the situation in the Sudan, and this means an updating of the political and intellectual forces in the Sudan. Of course, there are many different political, economic, and other forces who are engaged in a struggle to redistribute, if we can call it that, power and authority and resources. Sudan is a country for opportunity and challenges. Sudan is a very rich country, but we can also say that Sudan is steeped in poverty. We can talk about great peoples in the Sudan with wonderful legacies and values, but we can also talk about how will it be possible to utilize these opportunities and deal with the challenges. We have different methodologies. There are And the political horizon, we'll find uh, a, a mosaic of forces and political forces from the extremist right to the extremist left and everything else that goes in between. From the extreme right, what's known as the Islamists, to the liberal forces and the Marxists and Leninists and new Marxists and neo-Marxists, and these approaches, one way or another, have contributed to the different factors in creating the obstacles on the path of dialogue, because both the sectarian and the political powers, in the opinion of some, are just cliches, and they can converge or diverge with the political forces accordingly. When we talk about sectarian forces, we mean that in the strongest terms who engage in practices, and even in the period of transition, they stuck to their positions. And even when we talk about Marxist forces, they also want to keep to their entrenched positions to safeguard what they call as their historical gains. Also, we have the powers, the armed groups and others who have their militias, they have their achievements, and the United Nations agency talk about 43.8 million people in as the population of Sudan. They are going through now through a demographic transition, and this is an important strategic consideration for anyone who wants to engage in changing the situation, whether from inside or the outside country. Sudan is going through a demographic change, and of course, any demographic change will necessarily have an impact on the political system. There are some 25.8 million youth in the Sudan who are one way or another were engaged or are engaged in changing the system, and the the Sudan has an opportunity for 50 years to come. Until 2070 will remain a young country in our population. 30% of the population live in cities, urbanized in major and cities and small towns and cities. 70% live in the traditional agricultural uh, land. Also, the percentage of women to men is also important because it reflects the nature of women's participation in the attempt to change, and especially in the revolution. Also, there are also a number of feminist movements who trying to feminize the political movement and stand up to the patriarch um, system. The number of illiterate people, some say 50 or 60%. I don't know how accurate this figure is, but we know dictatorial regimes do not pay much attention to education. There are basic players, and like I may have mentioned them, the traditional political parties like the Ummah Party, the Democratic Union. We have modern or semi-modern political parties. We have civil society organizations, NGOs and CSOs, and they are on their way to formulate ascending and rising powers of change, because in the revolution they came under the banner of the forces of liberty and change. And this is also a question: why have these have not just become engaged in political activity, but they took part in ruling the country? We have the armed movements also. Now they are going through a process of review socially. In the past, there were so many of them, and they were all looked at them equally, and all of them looked at them as legitimate movements representing legitimate rights and claims for the populations they represent. Now there is some sort of a revision of some political forces who claim that they used to defend the values of democracy, freedom, liberty, and the secular state. Now, because some armed movements were found to be in the grip of the armed forces and the rapid intervention forces. There are other armed groups which belong to, until now, to a different division, like the popular movement, uh, Abdul Wahid Muhammad Ahmed al-Noor's movement, because until now their declared positions is such that they look at the Sudanese crisis in a holistic way, and there are projects like a new Sudan project or something, which is proposed by the popular movement North. We have also the social movements, the new youth movements, like for example Grifna and Change Now, which are now working silently. There is another movement called Ghadibun, or the angry, or the angry lot or something, and they were active. Some of the activities were like 2 days ago. We have also the civil administration, which was created by the colonial power in the remote peripheral provinces, which are one way or another are going through the sort of the end of the cycle because of the demographic changes. Day by day they are losing their importance. This forced them to ally themselves with the military establishment and the armed movements, and started using a different logic or a different description of what's happening in the Sudan, and they're starting to call people to go back to a tribal approach, and they're calling on people to view the Sudanese as tribal groups. There is another actor which plays a role from time to time, and that is to facilitate the process of reconciliations, and that is the Sufi orders. For example, we saw lately two major initiatives. One sided with the coup, the other one was closer to the opposition forces. Tayyib al-Jid, this is a Sufi sheikh, and the sheikh of the Kadabas region. And in the last group, which is probably the most important in my estimation, which is now the resistant committees, which is the new term which entered the literature, the RC. There are bodies or entities which are both of political, revolutionary, and provide services, which were formed in 2013 during the demonstrations called protesting against high prices and killing civilian demonstrators, and they started reforming their role in the latter days of al-Bashir's rule until now have become more able to incite people on the street and I think from 25th October, which the army made its coup, within an hour, thousands of Sudanese men and women took to the streets in protest. So the ability to incite these people to move was attributed to the resistance committees. Of course, on the 25th of October, we'll reach the first anniversary of the coup, and throughout the last year, at least on weekly basis, there were demonstrations. This has paralyzed the military establishment, their allies, to rule. They made the Sudan an unruling country, a country which cannot be ruled, and made people realize that any solution which does not satisfy the youth movements and their allies will not be meaningful or of strategic importance. The resistance committees, especially after the signing of the agreement with the political forces, until now, there's a debate in Sudan which says that the forces of freedom and change, I think, which is made up of some 45 different entities. Some have left them, like the professional wing, TAM, one of the movements. Some civil society organizations left them, but there is a continuous debate that the forces of freedom and change could have taken the responsibility of fully ruling the country, but they did not and preferred to engage in a partnership with the army. This is something that many people think should not be repeated, that and they say no, a very radical position after what happened before, and now we have the radical change forces vis-a-vis the previous lot, the freedom and change forces. We need in the Sudan to open a dialogue at two levels. One which is in between, like self reflection, a self searching monologue, not a dialogue, within each political force or party, because by nature these forces have huge problems. Because over the years they were penetrated, they were deprived, they were attacked, they were deprived of financing and finding financial backing, but at the same time, they are relatively new and novice. They lack, like Rasha Awad's book puts this nicely and says democracy without democrats. Of course, some forces have the elements in them, but not all of them. Also, there are structural problems and also question. They have issues with governance and their inability as political powers to come up with the kind of political programs which can respond to people's needs. Also, the resistant committees called themselves or gave themselves a kind of structuring, and they tried to come up with a charter, political charters, to express their positions in rejecting any compromise or negotiations or partnership. They started in a small village near the area of Sennar. They started developing. Before we move to the final theme, I just want to ask you, so far as political parties don't have confidence in the resistance committees, one of the ways and means that the political parties try to do their job, they try to penetrate other other political forces. If they manage to penetrate the army, they can do that with others. Okay, there is a long journey of developing these charters, which will be culminated next Wednesday in signing the so-called revolutionary charter to establish people's rule or people's authority. Of course, this is mainly political forces inside the country and 5 protest movements. And there are other voices nowadays calling for the cancellation of the Juba peace agreement. People think it's not worth the paper it's written on, because this revolutionary front, the first mistake they made is they sided with the coup. And I don't want to call it project, because project is a big word. This was a deadly mistake. When they stood against democracy, it was a deadly mistake. And when they stood against the Sudanese people who are killed in their hundreds every day, and also most of the leadership did not express the kind of efficiency in their leadership tasks. And during the war itself, people can be more extremist when it comes to change and democracy. When they lay their hands on power, they turn into a bad version of the previous regime they stood against. The peace agreement is something we should understand, and we should also distinguish between peace agreements, and the failure of the movements to reach a peace agreement with Abdel Aziz movement and Muhammad Ahmed's movement. These are important movements. Reaching an agreement with them is more important. The Juba peace agreement should not negate the necessity to reach an agreement with Abdel Aziz Al-Hulu or Abdel Wahid. Abdel Aziz Al-Hulu, his project is very clear. He wants to restructure the state in Sudan in a different, new way, and to identify the question of identity, like what Muhammad Yusuf has said. Also, so far as the relationship between the state and religion and other things that other powers want to evade. So a project like this requires dialogue with these two important movements. We cannot ignore that. Thank you, Mr. Alhaj. Before we open the floor, please allow me to make a comment. December Revolution 2018 had participation from all factions of Sudanese society. These forces had differences between them in various degrees, but they agreed on one thing, and that is to get rid of the previous regime. So therefore, if we want to break the current impasse, our number one priority should be to establish a democratic civilian front to work as a minimum objective to achieve a transition to civilian rule and democratic rule, regardless of the mechanisms. Each party can do that. Thank you. Now we can open the floor to your questions and answers. 1 minute, please, each. Thank you, Abdul Khaliq Shaib. I'm a lawyer from Sudan. I have one comment and 3 questions. The general comment is we agree that there is a crisis, but we differ on how to describe it, and there is consensus that we should break this impasse if we wanted to keep the Sudan. I don't think there can be one solution that everybody agrees on. The first session talked about concepts. The second session should talk about pragmatic solutions. We can say it's difficult to have a solution that satisfies everybody. There is no magic wand. There's no Moses' shaft to solve our problems. Moses' staff. If there is weakness in the military coup, we know as Sudanese that this coup has 2 heads. So we have to think also if one of them decides to get rid of the other, the army of the rapid intervention or vice versa. The coup has the army had the upper hand after getting rid of the Bashir regime. Are the Sudanese prepared to accept solutions that can require concessions and big ones? My final question to Ahmed. The civilian rules have failed in solving the problems. The resistant committees are different than the traditional political, Sufi, and civil society organizations. They are run from the bottom up, and also this makes it difficult for other parties to judge them and hold them accountable. Do you think this crisis of confidence can be overcome between the resistance committees and the political parties in the opposition, not the army? Can there be any flexibilities in their position, the RC's positions? We can take another question. Thank you. Thank you for all your contributions. Miss Russia, there is two sides that armed and non-armed civilians. Although there is the army and the armed groups, so the armed part is more in numbers and ability. This is a very complex issue. The civilians are the people who went had sittings outside the government offices. What role can they play? Also, Mr. Ahmed talks about the demographic makeup as a given, as mortality and fertility and migration as the three main elements when it comes to understanding or analyzing the demographic situation. Now there is demographic change in the Sudan, and this is not a coincidence. There are people who have an interest, a vested interest to create this demographic change. This is in addition to all the other elements. If we're talking about Darfur, now there is a forceful migration, there is displacement in areas which are part of the change, movement of change in Sudan, changing deliberately the demographic makeup can lead to more complex things. Secondly, also, if there is unification of charters possible with the presence of the steering committee of the lawyers, can we find an umbrella for all? Okay, we'll answer these questions if we have time afterwards. So far as the scenario of the two heads of the coup engaging in conflict, this is possible if there is an attempt to have a military coup within the army, and some are banking on a military coup by the army, even if this leads to a military confrontation with the rapid intervention, and this is where the Islamists are banking on, but this is an alternative which will be very perilous. It will lead the country to slip into civil war, definitely, due to the complexities of the situation. The armed groups have their own extensions in the community, ethnically, religiously, tribally, and regionally. So everybody will call their lot into arms and to engage in conflict. And this is a scenario all Sudanese should avoid because it will be a very destructive one. As for concessions, definitely any political solution will be based on mutual concessions. But the question remains as to what extent, what will be the determinants, what can we give concessions on, and what we cannot. This will be uh, governed by the balance of power. If there is a front or an entity which is strong, cohesive, able to show resistance and struggle on the ground and surrounds the coup people, whether military or civilians, this kind of a reality will make any political settlement without much concessions, although the question of concessions is there, and we should take it into consideration and should not be at an attempt to turn the thing into a political bazaar and everybody starts bidding for this, bidding for that. We're talking about political settlement following a proper logic and through standing and principle, respecting the principles, and also using the logic and the tools necessary. Now, the democratic and civilian forces in the Sudan, they have only peaceful struggle as means for struggling, and so ultimately this would lead to a negotiation, and how skillful the negotiators will be, and what legitimacy do they have, and what backing do they have from the people, and the forms of diplomatic, civilian, and other forms of struggle, and the ability to approach the international community, the regional powers. This equation, which will determine who will be will have the upper hand and towards proper demographic and democratic change. But if we rush into a settlement without these conditions prevailing, definitely the situation and the consequences will be even worse than when we signed the constitutional document. The division in Sudan is not between civilians and the military. It's between those who support democratization and those who do not. The civilians are on both parts. As for the people who are behind the sitting in front of the palace, they do not have a political weight independently from the military, because all the power they have comes from the military, and their power is just a reflection or a shadow of the military's power. And the Juba Agreement brought into play forces which are very weak politically and almost insignificant, but that agreement created for them a place in the balance of things, and because the coup people wanted to use them as incubators for their power, and this is what happened. Thank you, Abdul Khalik. I think the resistance forces have different dynamics, organizationally they are different, and they created a change in the concept of revolutions in the Sudan. That's why we have now a revolution which is different than April 1964 and other events. It's said now that there is 7,000 to 12,000 units of resistance committees from the north of Sudan to the south. They are networking with each other, and they're trying to rebuilding their organization. At the same time, they're trying to network with others, and maybe this can act as a catalyst, a civilian catalyst for creating change in the future. As for any dialogue between the political parties and the resistance committees have expressed willingness to engage in dialogue and flexibility, especially that they have university graduates and young people in their midst. But this also opens up the space for a question. In Sudan, as in general, whether talking about the police, rapid intervention, the military, political forces, there is a dogmatization in the mechanisms employed by any establishment. This is something we have to understand. Even the resistant communities, if we do not know how to deal with them, they'll be painting themselves into a dogmatic corner, and stick to their position and be entrenched in their positions. Also in the Sudan, it's army, the army, although there were hundreds of junior officers, they managed to waste that opportunity and close their eyes and ears to any dialogue and become very conservative. Also, the increase in the population of the Sudan, any citizen of the Sudan, now we're, we're not talking about the resettlements of people from abroad. Even the Sudanese themselves are increasing, which this makes the youth the majority. This is an important and strategic consideration. How the charters can be useful, I think the latest one, this is the one so-called the Revolutionary Charter, the Charter of the People. At the legislative level, at least, they're talking about electing people in the units from the working their way upwards from the smaller units to towns to cities to states, then the parliament, national parliament. The people who produce this charter, they want reaction with these products, intellectual products, and they want people to interact with these charters to create change. I will close by what Bertolt Brecht, the poet of dialectic, says, if we don't change things, we'll only expect more of the same, basically. Thank you very much. I think this seminar opens the floor to more dialogue. If there is one lesson we can learn from the Sudanese revolutions is that we cannot depose a military coup by one group or one political party. Thank you very much to you all.